The idea of freedom is a powerful thing. It's dramatic, emotional, and in some places loudly advertised. In fact, if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear it echoing across the Atlantic. The land of the free. A phrase delivered with such confidence that it sounds less like a description and more like a warning label. And this is usually the moment when, somewhere in Britain, someone quietly puts the kettle on, raises an eyebrow, and lets out a small, knowing laugh. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe, like my video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. Not a cruel laugh. Not an angry one, just that gentle British chuckle that says, "Oh, are we still doing this?" Because while Americans passionately declare themselves the freest people on earth, Brits tend to respond the same way they do to most grand claims, with mild confusion, dry sarcasm, and an irresistible urge to ask one simple question. Free compared to what, exactly? To understand why this gap exists, you first have to understand how differently both countries define freedom. In America, freedom is often presented as something loud and visible. Flags, slogans, rights shouted at full volume. Freedom is something you defend, announce, and sometimes wear on a t-shirt. In Britain, freedom is far less dramatic. It's subtle. It's being allowed to complain about everything while fully expecting nothing to change. It's not having to explain yourself when you take a holiday. It's knowing you can get sick without your bank account having a panic attack. This is where the laughter begins. Take healthcare, for example. In the United States, healthcare is often described as a matter of personal choice. You choose your provider. You choose your plan. You choose whether you can afford it. To Americans, this is freedom. To Brits, this feels more like being given a menu where every option says market price, and none of them come with chips. In Britain, healthcare is boring. Gloriously boring. You get ill, you see a doctor, you complain about the waiting time, and then you go home. No negotiations. No invoices that read like ransom notes. No choosing between treatment and rent. When Americans describe their system as freer because it offers more choice, Brits tend to wonder why freedom seems to involve so much paperwork and fear. And it's not that Brits think their system is perfect. They'll happily list its flaws for several hours if given the chance. But laughing at the idea that needing a credit card to survive is somehow a symbol of liberty, that part never gets old. Then there's work culture, which is where British amusement quietly turns into disbelief. In America, working long hours is often framed as freedom. The freedom to hustle, the freedom to grind, the freedom to answer emails at midnight and still feel grateful. In Britain, that sounds less like freedom and more like a hostage situation with motivational posters. British workers are legally entitled to paid holidays, not as a perk, not as a reward for loyalty, as a basic expectation. The idea that taking time off might be seen as laziness or disloyalty feels absurd. When Americans proudly explain that they only get a week off a year, Brits don't know whether to laugh or apologize on behalf of civilization. Freedom, from a British point of view, includes the freedom to stop working and still be allowed back the next day. And then we arrive at tipping culture, a subject that never fails to cause confusion. In America, tipping is framed as choice. You choose how much to tip, you choose whether your server can pay rent. In Britain, this system is viewed with the same suspicion reserved for suspicious phone calls and emails that start with, "Dear Sir." The British approach is simple. Pay people properly. Remove the moral maths from dinner. Enjoy the meal without performing mental calculations based on guilt. When Americans describe tipping as freedom for the consumer, Brits tend to notice that the only people without freedom in this arrangement are the workers themselves. Of course, no conversation about American freedom would be complete without mentioning policing. In the US, freedom is often linked to authority, power, and enforcement. In Britain, policing is quieter, less theatrical, and far less armed. The average British police officer doesn't carry a gun, which alone is enough to make many Americans deeply uncomfortable. Brits, meanwhile, find it unsettling that everyday interactions can escalate so quickly across the Atlantic. The idea that freedom requires constant force feels contradictory. Freedom, to the British mind, is being mildly told off by an officer who calls you mate and then lets you go with a warning. The laughter isn't mockery, it's confusion at how fear and freedom have somehow become roommates. Then there's surveillance, a topic where Britain absolutely does not get to act superior. CCTV cameras are everywhere. Brits know this, they joke about it, they accept it. But here's the difference. Britain doesn't pretend it's freedom. It just shrugs and carries on. Americans, on the other hand, often insist they are not being watched while voluntarily giving every detail of their lives to private companies. To Brits, this contradiction is endlessly entertaining. Being monitored by the government is tyranny. Being monitored by corporations is convenience. The mental gymnastics alone deserve applause. And yet, for all the laughter, Brits are not blind to their own contradictions. Britain has its own rules, restrictions, and quiet absurdities. You can't carry pepper spray. You can't jaywalk without side-eye. You can be fined for the wrong bin on the wrong day. Freedom in Britain is not about doing whatever you want, it's about knowing the limits and complaining about them creatively. Which brings us to the real reason Brits laugh at American claims of freedom. It's not because America lacks freedom. It's because it talks about it constantly. In Britain, freedom doesn't need marketing. It's not a slogan, it's not shouted. It exists in the background, quietly functioning. You're free to criticize the government relentlessly. Free to mock public figures mercilessly. Free to be sarcastic about everything, including freedom itself. Americans tend to defend freedom like it's under constant threat. Brits treat it like a utility. If it stops working properly, they complain to everyone except the people who can fix it. So when Americans proudly announce they are the freest nation on earth, Brits don't feel challenged, they feel entertained. Not because the claim is entirely wrong, but because it sounds like someone shouting about how relaxed they are. True freedom, from a British perspective, doesn't need convincing. It doesn't arrive with fireworks. It doesn't require comparison. It's quiet, slightly inconvenient, deeply imperfect, and mostly taken for granted. And maybe that's why the laughter is so gentle. Because, in the end, both nations value freedom. They just express it very differently. One waves it like a flag. The other mutters about it while waiting for the kettle to boil. So the next time you hear someone declare themselves the freest person alive, remember, if you have to say it out loud, a Brit somewhere is probably smiling, sipping tea, and enjoying the freedom not to argue back. And if you've ever experienced freedom differently, on either side of the Atlantic, you already know where the real conversation begins. But there's another layer to this conversation. One that really explains why Brits don't just laugh, but laugh quietly. Because when you look closely, American freedom often comes with a surprising amount of anxiety attached to it. In Britain, most freedoms are assumed. You don't wake up thinking about them. You don't defend them daily. You simply live your life and complain when the train is late. In America, freedom feels more guarded, protected, almost fragile, something that must be constantly asserted, defended, and shouted, just in case it slips away while no one is looking. That difference alone fascinates Brits. Because nothing makes you question how free you are quite like being told, repeatedly, how free you're supposed to feel. Take consumer freedom. Americans have endless choice, dozens of cereal brands, hundreds of TV channels, thousands of subscription services. To Americans, this abundance equals liberty. To Brits, it feels suspiciously like being trapped in a supermarket aisle for eternity, paralyzed by options and still somehow choosing the wrong one. British freedom is simpler. Fewer choices, fewer decisions, fewer chances to regret them. You might not have 20 types of bread, but you'll survive. And survival without stress is, in itself, a kind of freedom. Then there's the obsession with rights. Americans know their rights by heart. They quote them, defend them, argue over them. In Britain, most people vaguely assume they have rights and only find out the details when something goes terribly wrong. It's not confidence. It's calm indifference. That's why Brits don't argue when Americans call themselves a free nation. They don't need to, they just watch, listen, and quietly enjoy the contrast. One country treats freedom like a sacred performance, the other treats it like background noise. And maybe that's the real punchline. Freedom doesn't look the same everywhere. Sometimes it's loud, proud, and constantly announced. Other times, it's so ordinary you forget it's there at all. Which raises one final question. Is freedom something you declare, or something you barely notice until it's gone? And that's where the laughter fades, and the conversation actually gets interesting.